Hello, 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 and welcome back to what will be the final episode of Fire Emblem 7 ROM Hack Dream 5 by Astra Luna Soul. My name is Pondon, and we're here to talk a little bit more about the game. I spent about 30 minutes rambling on about the units, my thoughts about them. I would say to kind of sum that video up, if you're just joining us, is that some of the units were good, some of the units were not so good. There were some units that played their roles really well, others that didn't. I would say unit balance is important, but it's not going to be the most important thing. Like, if everyone has a role to play, then that's fine. Like, if there's one situation where I want to use a unit, then it's worth them being there, especially like in a game that's tough like this. Like, there's really not a lot of room for specialization because I just need people to survive and do big damage. Like, that's really like what this game is about. But I do want to take some time to talk a little bit more about the maps. And so I'm not gonna. No, I'm at the wrong chapter here. Let's see what else we can look at here map-wise. Let's go here. So we've got some dragons, whatever. So like, let's look at some maps. So let's talk about maps, guys. So like, the maps in this game, they look fantastic, but they are so big. They are so big. They're too big. I mean, it's just so big. And like the amount of time and effort it must have taken to build all of these, like my God, like I feel bad. Like these maps are just too big. And I think this is more so a symptom of the times than anything else. Like back in the day, people wanted more Fire Emblem when there was only, FE7 and Sacred Stones out in the West, and like those really the only games you could play. And before like ROM hacking was super accessible, which was like when this game was made. Even though this came out a little bit after like FE10, I think, or FE11, or right after. Even this game even started before Awakening was made. To give you some context, like this game is like, there's a lot of innovation that's happened in Fire Emblem since this game has come out, which I will certainly caveat as an important point when I'm making my critique. However, I think the mentality around large maps has changed very drastically. I remember when I was younger and newer in the Fire Emblem community, people just wanted more. We had only a few games, and once people could like start making maps and putting them into games and ROMs and stuff like that, everyone's like, let's just make the biggest map possible. It'll be super epic. It'll be super cool. I just want to get all these units fighting each other. It'll be really neat. And it sounds neat and it looks neat, but when it comes to actually playing, it's really not that much fun to kind of like sit around and wait and take care of wave after wave after wave. And I think, I don't think the community has just shifted its mentality since then. I think if you kind of go back to the way the community even used to look at units, right, where it was like you would talk about units in the context of like, what are they going to be at 2020 and how good are they at endgame. And this sort of mentality lends itself to these big epic battles because it's like you just want a unit that's going to be really freaking strong, and you don't really care about like the context in which they're really strong. Like people thought Nino was like the best unit in FE7 because she's really strong for endgame and has great growths. Versus now it's like people talk about like Marcus as like being the best unit in FE7 because he helps you clear chapters more quickly, right? But his endgame potential is not as great. And so, like, it's kind of flipped the whole model on its head. And I think that because of that shift in how people look at units, I think there's also a shift in how people look at maps. Like, low turn count playthroughs have become so much more relevant. Playing efficiently has become seen as so much more important. And I think the modern Fire Emblem player definitely values these a lot more when looking at different units and has, like, a different sort of thought process to that. Which I think it's something like when this game came out and was first being developed, I don't think that mentality really existed yet. And if it did, it certainly wasn't as pervasive as it is now. And so what you have is a game that made these really big maps and now an audience that's playing them that doesn't want them, at least how I see it. Like the big maps are neat, they look great, but from a playing standpoint, like I want to play my maps quickly. I want to focus on getting through the map in a reasonable amount of time and like collecting all the objectives. I don't want to just like stand in one place and fight wave after wave after wave to get my guys up to 2020 so that I can talk about how cool they are. You know, it's a very different sort of approach now. And I think this game suffers a little bit for that. And in that way, I would say like the game hasn't aged super well at least from a gameplay standpoint with the maps. And so I guess my thesis or like overarching summary of everything I've just said is that like the community has changed its opinion on units, and thus I think as a result, it's also changed the opinion on how like what makes a map good. It's like the biggest maps that are super grand like aren't nearly as popular as like maps that are just like tight and have a lot going on and encourage you to play quickly. And so I think that this game definitely suffers a little bit for that. I will add, I think a lot of the maps would be made better with just like turn down the reinforcements by like 2 or 3 turns each in some of the cases, and I think it would just make the flow a lot better. Like the pacing in a lot of the later maps especially isn't great. And when you think about reinforcements and this is something that like I've struggled with as well, but trying to get better at, with reinforcements, think about them from like a sense of like the progression of the player. And the reinforcements are there to pressure the player in some way. And in most cases, you're giving them reinforcements to slow them down or to encourage them to speed up. And those situations would be like a reinforcement that encourages you to speed up. That's like a brigand going for a town or a thief going for a chest. And those are things that are happening farther away from you and you're racing to get to a specific point on the map. That's when the reinforcement encourages you to move. When the reinforcement is trying to slow you down, that's when they're like spawning a little bit more near you. They're generally combat oriented. They make you have to rethink your strat a little bit, divert your resources to different areas that you might not have been expecting. And it kind of encourages you to like use a specific choke point that you may not have been using before, or leave a unit behind to deal with them. You know, so it's a little bit different. And this game, I think it does the anti-turtle stuff. I think sometimes with like the thieves and the brigands and stuff like that. Like that there was a thief in this chapter, right? There was some other stuff as well that I'm not really recalling right now on the thief front. There really wasn't too much of it, but there was a lot of let's slow the player down with reinforcements and let's make the player divert resources to take care of them. And there's a balance that needs to be struck between giving the player reason to like panic and divert their resources, and then there's also like a question of like farming them. Like there were some chapters, especially these later ones, where I'm just like leaving my guys in like this one tile choke and letting them just farm reinforcement after reinforcement after reinforcement, and it's preventing me from progressing through the map, because to take a more offensive position would be really deleterious because the reinforcements are too strong. And so I have to kind of play this very slow and steady way and dismantle these units one by one in order just to get through the map. And so you could argue that, hey, if the reinforcements were weaker, would you care as much? I'm like, yeah, but would the game be as fun then? I think it's just a matter of having fewer reinforcements so that you got a little bit of that flavor and a little bit of that change up without bludgeoning the player and forcing them through the slog. So I think this game would have benefited a lot from overall just fewer reinforcements, especially because these maps are so big and they all take so long. And dying is really hard on you, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Like, that's something that I think needs to be brought into consideration. Let's just move around a little bit, see a different part of the map over here. So yeah, so like, what else can I say about this game? Map-wise, just like in general, I think in terms of like map and design, like the maps are all very pretty. The early game maps, while they skew a little big, I think they're fine. I think the early game was really strong overall. Like, it felt a little bit more well balanced. Like, there was definitely like some slowness and kind of like reflecting back on like some of those early chapters. I feel like I definitely need to play very safely. This game is definitely enemy dense. It's definitely enemy phase oriented as much as I like want it to be player phase oriented. It's definitely an enemy phase oriented type game. There's a lot of 1-2 range. I would say the maps definitely took... I loved the early game overall, but I would say the maps definitely took a nosedive in overall quality and fairness, kind of post-route split. And I'm curious what the B route would have entailed and how that would have been handled. I've heard it's overall a little bit more fair, according to some of the other folks that have talked to me about it. I would say that with A route, like, the stuff without the convoy, like, that was really garbage. Like there were so many chapters where I think I would have done so much better if the game just let me use my convoy, and there was really no reason for them not to let me use the convoy at that particular juncture. So that kind of miffed me a little bit. Um, that was probably the most unfair part, was just taking away the convoy. Um, Trying to think what else is there to say. Like, I mean, I feel like I've given a lot of my comments on the maps throughout each chapter, but I'd say, like, for those of you who are making hacks or making maps, always try to make the map smaller. Always try to tighten things up, tighten up the flow, and you'll have a better experience. Like, no one wants to drag their units around through like a big castle just to get them from point A to point B to fight someone. Like, you want there to be a meaningful decision to be made on every single turn. And that's like choosing to attack, how to position. Like, every turn there should be something. And that helps create better pacing, and it creates a better experience. And even a long map can be engaging if you have this sort of dynamic. But if you have like a big map where it's like all the enemies come at you at once, and you have all this empty space, like, there's a pacing problem there. There's not really meaningful decisions to be made every turn. You're kind of just like waiting for the chapter to be over. That's really important to consider. And I think, especially like if you're a first-time hacker or first-time map maker, I know I've done this a lot too, and I've been working on it, is you're going to make the maps too big. You don't need nearly as much space as you think you do. You can always tighten the map up. So when you playtest, and playtest a lot, you should see, like, do I need this much space to do what I need this map to do? And most of the time, you won't. There are some situations where you may want to do a bigger map, and that could be, you know, maybe there's like another army fighting on a different side, or there is a, or your units are split up or something like that, and they want to approach from different angles, but you don't want them to rejoin together too soon. Like, maybe that case, like a big map is fine. You give someone warp and want to hedge against like warp strats, like, okay, then just don't give them warp as far as I'm concerned. But or make like so there's different incentives to not just like warp skip the map. Regardless, always focus on tightening up your maps, and it feels like the first arc of the game felt like pretty well oiled, like well tested, well balanced. The second part of the game, there was a notable difficulty spike. There was a lot of the map chapters were slow overall. It certainly felt like there was just more testing that needed to be done. So test your maps. These maps don't feel like super well tested overall. Like, they definitely need some tweaking. But again, it depends on the experience that the designer was intending. I don't know the designer. I can't speak to him or like how he thinks. This guy Estra. All I know is that he made a really sick soldier animation, and that he made a really great looking game. But it still like in my mind needs some work, at least to appeal to someone like me. I may be in the minority here. I don't know, but I'm just saying my thoughts on the matter. Let's see. What else can I say about this game conceptually? So, as much as I rag on the map, this game does have a lot of really neat concepts. A lot of really neat concepts. Like, come on, you come to this castle and you think you're gonna fight this old dude who is mean and has been mean to a lot of people, and then all of a sudden he's like, actually, dragons. And you have to fight 3 of these dragons as bosses. And like defeating 3 bosses is cool. I like the way this chapter's laid out conceptually, where it's like you have these 3 groups, you have these 3 paths, you want to use the dragons, but there's just too much going on to justify splitting up your army this much, and they're too weak. And that's kind of like what happens a lot in this game, is that you have a lot of really neat concepts, but oftentimes the balance changes it so much that you don't even really get to take full advantage of what the concept was. So like, it's clear that the game intends for you to go up each of these 3 paths, fight each of the 3 dragons, but like the way your units are balanced and just like the makeup of your army, it's very hard to do that successfully because everyone is so squishy and there are too many enemies and you're taking too many hits at once. So you want to huddle up with a larger group to kind of gang up on the enemy. I would say similarly, like Chapter 9, where you get all of your units back one by one, and then the boss appears out of nowhere and like can crit you. Like, that's really tough. But it's a cool concept where you have all these units coming in at different points in the map. They're all searching for Renaer. They come in at different points. It makes sense. It's cool. It's different. It's memorable. But then like the boss just shows up with crit, and it's like, right, like there's no warning about where he's going to show up. and that can really screw you over after like a long chapter. So stuff like that, right? Where it was like these amazing ideas that just didn't execute themselves really well. I'm gonna take a sip of water. All right, that helps. So there's like some great concepts that weren't super executed super well, maps that could be tightened. But beyond that, man, like I think the game gives you some pretty interesting units to work with. Like I'm definitely a fan of Fire Emblem games where it's like I feel like my units are scrubs and I'm like constantly trying to like figure out how to make this work with them. I think that's especially fun in the early game. I think now it's like getting to a point where it's like I have some units that are just not salvageable at all because even like in their scrubbiness they really can't do that much. And I have such juggernauts now that it's like it's just become very uneven and like I kind of need to low man to get through some of this stuff, unfortunately, which I'm not really crazy about. Like enemy phase oriented gaming encourages low manning. That's just kind of the way it goes. And especially when like most of your best units are squishy. And by best I mean it's like they're good offensively, they can actually kill stuff reasonable. You're gonna want to low man a little bit more. You're gonna want to use a lot of choke points. You're gonna want to wait things out. You're not gonna want to attack in player phase because you're not gonna want to like risk getting countered and all that kind of stuff. So again, I appreciate a lot of the concepts that this game has, but the execution still needs some polishing. Let's see. Other than that, like the game also look, the game looks fantastic. The art is all amazing. The maps are really on point. The music, like custom music, and just like some of the stuff is easy to take for granted because now it's so easy to do a lot of this stuff. I mean, art is obviously still the same as it ever was. Like, this game's art is impressive, both now and 7 years ago. But stuff like entering music, custom events, moving stuff around on the map, the graphics for, like, those scenes, like the execution scene, or, like, when that assassin lady, like, almost kills Gareth, and you see, like, this actual hand-drawn art that gets input into the game, like the effort is astounding and it looks great, but it's still not a finished hack. It looks great. Like this game holds up super well. Like I think a lot of FE7 ROM hacks now just don't really look that sharp by comparison to the FE8, some of the newer FE8 ones. But this hack, like visually, like the aesthetics are gorgeous. Like there's so much effort put into that. Every like little weapon icon, like the Ram Revus and the Hurlbat and Halberd and the Iron Axe, like, they all look so good. It's all really good. Like, this game is a treat to look at. It's an absolute treat to look at. It has its own, like, kind of distinct style. It's just such a fun game to look at. I kind of touched on the writing and stuff before, but, like, I think the story is a little hard to follow, but I like the characters. The story is kind of just, like... The story feels like kind of just an excuse for us to, like, engage with these characters a lot of the time. Like, it feels more like, hey, let's like make a ROM hack with these characters that kind of do these kinds of things, and I guess this is the story, right? Like the story seems kind of like second to the characters, which I think it's fine. Characters and plots are good, but I think it should be a little bit easier for the player to follow and like understand like what this all means. Like I like kind of forgot that I was fighting to free Musain. Like I just didn't have enough context to like understand like what was going on. I think. So that's important. From a writing standpoint as well, the game does a nice job of like weaving in these other characters, like the minor lines, like Crow. I feel like it's a lot of lines that you wouldn't expect someone like him to get. Asher with Arcus, I thought that was a good conversation. Like there's a lot of stuff that goes on, and it just makes me think like when you have stuff like that, it's clear that the game wasn't meant to be Iron Man, and that's okay. And I think a lot of ROM hacks do this where like they assume that you're not going to Iron Man and take a more like modern approach to FE where it's like you're going to here's all the units. There's not going to be that many of them because we know you're not going to let that many of them die, and there's going to be this very clear trade-off between like here's the first guy you get. Here's like the female version that has better bases that'll be useful if your other guy got screwed over, right? Like it seems like very like neat in that way, but I think it also is quite restrictive. Like, I'm definitely more a fan of, like, assume the player will Iron Man, because that's, like, how Kaga would have done it. And so give them a lot of units to play with and mess around with. Give them reason to, like, feel okay about letting someone die. Like, I couldn't let any of my units die, because I was so strapped, and I had to reset. And maybe that's probably an intentional choice, but it's not necessarily one I always agree with. I think, especially with like how long these maps are, like you should expect the player to like lose a few units here and there, and they shouldn't be so punished because there's only like, oh, this is the only dark mage you get until like this chapter where you get her back up, and then that's it, you know. So like, I think I'm of the mind that you should be more generous with units in general. It would have been nice to have more units to play around with. It would have been nice to have been able to feel like I could have Iron Manned a little bit more, but overall, like, that's not a big gripe. I don't. It takes a lot of time to make characters and all that kind of stuff, so I get it. But I think designing with Iron Man in mind is something that like I've come around to pretty recently, and something that I've changed my tune on a little bit as well, because I recognize that dying in Fire Emblem sucks, and people might not want to play your ROM hack that much. And so if the game's going to be hard, then you should give them some alternatives, some different options, and some incentive to replay, because if you're able to make like all the units kind of good, then it becomes really challenging to think, okay, who can I use? Who do I not want to use? Versus here, it's like, if I go back and replay Dream of 5, I will probably do it exactly the same way, because I can't think of an alternative where I use like other units more. Like maybe I would use Driscoll a little bit more. But what would that actually amount to, right? Like I still am going to need to use like Amelia and Gabe and these other units, right? Like I think that it didn't feel like there were enough alternative ways to play, in part because there were a low unit count, but also because the units I had were just so good that it would be hard to justify not using them again. So something to consider from a design perspective for you. I don't think this hack clearly like does its thing, and I think it does it well. But personally, I would prefer a game that was a little bit more Iron Man friendly. This game did not feel Iron Man friendly very much at all. Other than that, like, let's see. My favorite map was probably 8AX, honestly. Like, as unfair as it was really satisfying to win. I love Fog of War. I love the way the map was laid out. It was really scary. It was high pressure. Every turn mattered until kind of it got to the end and there was really nothing else coming at me, and I kind of just had to like walk over to the boss. But that's more of a fault of like how big the map was, and that I felt like I needed to turtle. But it's probably one of my favorite maps. The earlier maps were pretty good. Like the castle maps in this game were all too big. I didn't care for any of the castle maps, really. I liked that map where you get Juan, you have to go down within the time limit because you're running away. I like the Fog of War map where you have to get on the throne or the fort and you pick up Gabe from the village. That was a pretty well designed and well paced chapter, I thought. The chapter where you get Driscoll, that's probably like the tightest map in the game. I liked that one quite a lot as well. Otherwise, like some neat concepts, but some execution. Like none of the other ones like particularly stood out to me as like super great or memorable. But overall, like the game was fun to play. I had a great time. I would certainly play it again. Not right now. I need a break from it. I think next time I definitely want to try out the A route and see what that entails. Or, I'm sorry, the B route and see what that entails. But overall, like I've enjoyed this game quite a lot. It's clear that there was a lot of love put into it. It's a shame that it'll never be finished because it has so much there. Like the base is so solid and it's so polished that with just a little bit of tweaking on the gameplay front, like you would have a really solid game, and you know you're pretty close to a complete one. Like it's really, really good. It's really good, and like as much as I've harped on those things, it's more so for me just like to articulate my own thoughts on them versus like rip apart the game. Like I think the game is good. Like this is definitely one of the most memorable ROM hacks I've played. It was a lot of fun. It was hard. I don't agree with how they did the difficulty, but it was satisfying to win. But towards the end, like these past few chapters, I've kind of just been waiting for this to be over because it just gets to be too much of a slog. And I think that's just like those are easy fixes. Those are easy fixes. This game is certainly redeemable, and I think it's really, really solid. I would certainly play this again. I would certainly recommend this to anyone who likes Fire Emblem and wants to see a challenge. Like this is definitely a good one. There are some things it does that I don't like. It's certainly not for the faint of heart, but it's still a really good ROM hack. I think it's unique. It's ambitious. I think ambitious is really the right word for this hack. It's a super ambitious project. I mean, that's why it didn't get finished. But hey, it's really good for like 15 chapters. I spent a lot of time on this, so I gotta say I've enjoyed it. But I'm gonna miss it. It's been fun. This is the longest LP I've done. And I'd say overall, like, the game like hits a lot of things, does a lot of things right. There's a lot of things right. Some of the things it does wrong I think are pretty obvious, but it's going to be a matter of perspective. I think tightening the maps, being a little bit more fair to the player, giving the player a couple different options in terms of units would have been nice, I think. But man, oh man, like beautiful game, great soundtrack. The scenes were really good. The tone was excellent. The characterization was on point. The dialogue was all fantastic. You know, I really did like this game. Some of the gameplay stuff itself needs work, and that's probably the weakest point, unfortunately, and that just kind of makes it the most obvious because it's what you're actually doing. But the nuts and bolts are there, so like you can definitely take some notes on like aesthetic from this game, on character writing from this game, and take some notes on like how to make maps better. Some of these maps are just too big. You know, look at your own maps and say like this is probably too big, and make it tighter. How do I incentivize like this game like definitely tries to make you do certain things, but it's just too hard to actually do them. And that's a balancing issue that could be resolved. So keep that in mind, guys. But I hope this has been helpful. I've enjoyed playing this game a lot. I certainly would love to see it finished someday, although I don't think that's ever going to happen. It was really fun. And I'll probably do A-Rod at some point, or B-Rod at some point. But anyway, guys, my name is Pondan. Thank you again for watching. This has been Dream of Five by Astral Luna Soul. 2012, guys, just consider how much has changed since then. And how good this hack still is. Like, that's really impressive. I really liked this. Certainly would recommend it. But yeah, take care, guys. My name is Pondan. Like, subscribe. Let me know your thoughts. How did you feel about this hack? I really liked it. And next time, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. So stay tuned, and I'll see you there.